Welcome everyone to another episode of Cinematic Realms. I'm your host, John Webster. With me, as always, is my trusty co-host, Jared, and we have a special guest this week, Dan, Mr. Voice of Geekdom himself. Welcome, Dan. It's so great to have you. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has been a little while. I'm not that special, really. It's guest. I'm a guest.
You are to us. So.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back. And yeah, as you say, it's been a little while. I think I don't know. Probably something Star Trek was probably the last time we did a stream or something.
I think it was the third season of Picard.
Yeah, it could have been. Yeah. Could have been. Yeah. And I've never done a stream with Jared either. I think we've talked before on Zoom and stuff, but I don't think we've done a stream
I think we may have been on together for one of Stev's Here Be Dragon streams back in the day, but that would have been the only time.
Okay.
But yeah, no, it's great to have you on, and this was nice because this sort of organically got planned as the show we're talking about today was on the air. I know right off the bat you were like, if you do a stream on this, John, I'd love to talk about it. I'm like, yes, that would be great. And of course, it was a bumpy road for me to get here because this show put me on a roller coaster, emotionally speaking, and in some other ways. As we got towards the end of it, I've just been so blown away by it. But we're going to talk about some of the ups and downs for me, and how you guys felt about the show. We're of course talking about X-Men '97. Which is the long awaited revival of of a favorite. I know a favorite of mine, X-Men the animated series, and I will say it feels like, as much as I always loved most of the Fox films, and for years they did become X-Men for me. There is something about whenever I go back to the animated series, and once again with this show, there is just a feeling of returning home to, to the X-Men that I grew up on, and it's always so much fun to go back to, after years of having gotten used to Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, to hear Cal Dodd's voice, back being gruff and like we love him.
Did Cal Dodd ever have like a cameo in any of the Fox films? I feel like he did, but I don't know when.
No, as a matter of fact, I think the only actor, at least in the first film, to have a cameo was George Buza, Beast. He's in the beginning. He's the truck driver who drops Rogue off in Canada.
Right.
Of course, I didn't know that when I was little because I had no idea what the voice actors looked like. But yeah. So yeah, I'm just a huge fan, obviously, of the original animated series. I watched it Saturday mornings. I was glued to my TV. So when Disney announced this as part of their slate of upcoming projects, and all of a sudden there was just this real quick flash on the screen that said X-Men '97 with the animated characters, I was like, wait, hold on, what now? And it's been a couple years wait since then to get this show, but I was so excited for it to finally get here, and just had a blast watching it this season. It went by so fast, and but I've cherished every second we've gotten. Dan, since you're our guest this week, I'll let you go next. What's your history with the X-Men in general and the animated series?
It was a similar story, really. We're similar ages, so I also grew up with the animated show. Yeah, it was my Saturday morning routine was this and other things, you know, Animaniacs and stuff like that I used to love back in the day. But this was one of the big ones for me as a kid. It was my introduction, I think, to superheroes, really, in general. So yeah, I think my relationship to the show over the years has evolved in that. I was actually probably as a kid, I was a bigger fan of animated Spider-Man show, which took place kind of in the same world. But as I've gotten older, I've gotten to appreciate this show more. I think the original show, I mean the '90s show, it's just aged superbly well. And I think it's a lot to do with like the mode of storytelling that X-Men sort of employs. It's a lot of allegory and a lot of kind of quite adult themes a lot of the time, but dressed up in this pulpy costumes and yeah, just wonderful characters as well. Like the X-Men are they're the blockbuster Marvel characters for me. Them, Spidey, few others. Like they're for years and years, like the Avengers and Iron Man and stuff that we now take for granted as being household names as part of the Marvel franchise. Like X-Men, when I was a kid, that was the big deal. That was the headliner. So it's great to see X-Men back on some kind of screen. It was animated Spider-Man and of course Batman the animated series, where it's like,
oh yeah,
that was the holy of my childhood, of my Saturday mornings. And as the years have gone on, I've read comic books and so on and so forth, and gotten to know the source material a bit. And so I'll try and bring some of that conversation in a bit as we talk as well. But yeah, and the original series was just a brilliant adaptation. It's a perfect adaptation of the source material, in my opinion. It's not perfect, but it's a perfect adaptation.
Well, and I mean, it was always, you know, to unfortunately to the detriment of the live action films. As much as, like I said, there a good number of those films I love very dearly, but inevitably they were compared adaptation wise to what was done on the animated series, and you just were never going to maybe it'll get done one day, but I can't ever really imagine a better adaptation of the Phoenix Saga than what we got on the animated series. And you know, which is not to say, you know, the live action adaptations of that story have been flawed, but even if they weren't, it would still be a tall order to compete against what was done. And yeah, no, I just, it's funny you said about, you know, the X-Men being for you like the marquee Marvel characters, and I feel exactly the same way. It's probably a large part of the reason why I've had trouble like getting into, you know, the MCU in the way that a lot of people have, because growing up, you know, because they were back in the days of, you know, like the 90s, you know, characters like Iron Man and Captain America and, you know, Thor, they were known, but they just weren't, you know, I think for people from our generation, they just weren't on that level of what the X-Men and Spider-Man were.
Yeah, so, not at that point.
Yeah, and so I come with some bias there. Yeah, no, I finally feel very happy to see the X-Men making headlines again. And I'll share your love of Spider-Man, the animated series. I actually just started rewatching that series, and I'm like, oh my God, this is just as fun as I remember.
Peter Parker, voiced by the same voice actor who played Prince Eric in The Little Mermaid, which was fun.
And it was, I do have to throw this up because we did get a cameo in this series, as well as another one that shows both Peter Parker and Mary Jane.
That one was interesting. Sorry, I'll let you on.
No. I think I was going to talk about the same thing you were. That there was obviously a dangling storyline at the end of Spider-Man the animated series, and that kind of gives a big hint as to a resolution of that, and hopefully we'll get to see that someday.
Yeah, well, so it's a big question about this, because this is X-Men 97, and in theory the last season of Spider-Man the animated series would have taken place in 1998, if we can assume that each season took place in the year that it was released. And so arguably that should be the clone of Mary Jane at that point, maybe. But
well, we'll see.
I think the showrunners, the creators, and the whatnot have actually said that was the real Mary Jane. But yeah, my first reaction is that Mary Jane or not? Because we still don't really know until we get a continuation of that show. But anyways.
Yeah. All right, Jared. Sorry to make you wait, and I'm actually very interested to hear you speak about not only the show, but what your history with the show is, because by your own admission, you told me I think you haven't watched the series since it was on TV. So give us a little bit of your background with the show, and what your impressions were of the series.
Yeah, so I'm a couple years younger, so in 97 I would have been probably eight at the time. And so I hadn't seen a lot of the original animated series as it was airing, from at 92, I would have been a little bit too young for it. And in that age, I was very much into superheroes, as many boys my age would be, and girls. But I was most definitely first and foremost a Batman kid. I had all the Batman, the animated series stuff. I was very much more into the DC animated shows at the time, but I was aware of the X-Men animated series. Because it was also on at that time, and I just would catch an episode here or there, and it left an impression. It was like, when I think about the characters, when I think about like Wolverine and Cyclops and Storm, like those were the visions that I had in my head, when I was thinking about the characters. I wasn't reading comics at that age quite yet either. So I don't remember exactly when I watched the full series. To be honest, I can't even say for sure that I remember watching every episode, because it would have been at a time when, we didn't have those box sets and everything. And we didn't have all the episodes available on Disney Plus. I just caught the show when I caught it, and I always loved it when I caught it, but it was very much the Saturday morning cartoon feel. It was the kind of thing like you would sit down, you would watch the story. You might have missed an episode and be in the middle of a story arc, but at that age, you're really not going to get hung up on canon or like wait, what is the relationship? Why are these two characters fighting? You're just going to roll with it.
But I do have things to say about missed episodes and the reasons for missed episodes, which I'll get into after you finish.
Yeah, but the big reason I bring all that up is I really started to delve into the X-Men and their lore with the live action Fox films, in the early 2000s. And I think that that's when I actually made an effort to try and catch up on as much of the animated series as I could, even though, again, I can't speak to having seen all of it in the correct order. And as much as I always loved the animated series, as much as I always, had a very clear vision of like, okay, these are the characters who are considered pretty much the definitive adaptation, as beloved as characters like people like Hugh Jackman and Famke Johnson and James Marsden, as well as their respective characters, Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen as well. I knew that for like a lot of the people who were more hardcore into the X-Men than I do, that the animated series was considered the gold standard. Probably the first canon debate I was ever aware of at that age. Something I wish I could go back to is why aren't the X-Men suits yellow in the movies? But the reason I put all that is I was still very much invested in the live action movies. And because I was at the age when those were kind of what was going on, the animated series kind of took a little bit of a backseat for me. I always had affection for it, but I think I had mentioned to you previously, John, unlike Batman the Animated Series, which I have gone back and rewatched religiously multiple times, I have not revisited the original X-Men series since since that time period. And when I learned that this show, X-Men 97, was coming back, it kind of prompted me, being kind of having a completionist mindset in that way, to be like, okay, well, then I should go back and rewatch all the episodes before X-Men 97 starts. That's a taller order than you would, normally set for yourself, because, it's a 5-season show, and, even though the episodes are relatively shorter, some of them, it's still a lot. So I actually had held off on starting X-Men 97 because I was deluding myself that I was going to be able to rewatch all of the X-Men animated series before watching it. So I kind of fell behind. But I was seeing the excitement that people have for the show, that people like you two were having for the show. And it was making me want to catch up. And eventually one day I was just like, screw it. I'm not actually going to be able to do this project of rewatching the entire original X-Men animated show before I watch this. I'm just going to go into it. If I happen to stumble across something that I am like, that's a reference, I don't get it, that's what explainer videos are for. So I will go back and watch it then. But what I was absolutely delighted by watching the show was how little I found I actually needed to have seen the original animated series to appreciate the story that was telling. Obviously, for those who are, love the original animated series in their core, like I'm sure that enriched the experience immensely. But from the moment this show started, I was like, I'm really not having any trouble following this. I can tell that this is just like a really good story on its own merits. And there were only maybe 1 or 2 moments when in early episodes, like for instance, the Magneto Rogue connection, where I was like, was that a connection to the animated series that I don't remember? But as it turns out, it wasn't.
No,
and it's something from that's been alluded to in the comics, but it was something that the original show kind of never got into, and they actually kind of deal with that pretty elegantly in this show. So I was pretty impressed, and I also, being a few weeks behind, I did hear things through the grapevine. I was spoiled on the big episode 5 moment, for instance, but it honestly didn't affect my experience because, and this is a personal kind of philosophy for me, but spoilers really don't affect my enjoyment of a well-told story. And this was a very well-told story. And when I got to that moment, I was every bit as much emotionally moved as I would have been had I not known it was coming. And the way that it approached like the final, episodes and the ultimate reveal of who the villain was, by the time we got to the end, I was like, that was an incredibly well-crafted, superhero epic. And then we got to the post-credit scene, and I'm like, oh, and they're just going to be completely like full in on that now, are they? And because the other thing that I was pretty impressed with the show, but also perhaps a little bit surprised by, was not having been as re-entrenched in that original animated series kind of stuff. I was thinking back, like, they packed a lot of stuff into this season that probably could have been 3 full seasons of a different show. But for this show, it worked. And I'm happy I finally saw it.
Yeah, and I will say that was one of the things that early on in the season, I'm trying to think about to where I was upset about it, but I was struggling with it a little bit because it had been at least a good 13, 14 years since I had watched the original series. and I don't even think when I did that watch, I don't think I'd watched the entire thing. I think I'd watched like the first 2 seasons straight through, and then selected bits of the rest of the series. And 13, 14 years, that's a long time, and your memory can play tricks on you. And I think I still had the memory of the original series from when I was a little kid, in which I felt like, every storyline was this, meticulously drawn out, perfectly paced, uh, epic storytelling. And when you actually go back to watch the original series as an adult, as great as it still is, it does move very fast. And it moves through a lot of storylines very fast. So I was actually happy that towards the end of the season, I actually pressed pause on watching week to week, and I was like, let me go finish my rewatch of the original series. And I actually did plow through it all, and I was happy that I did that, because I think it put me in the right frame of mind to sort of judge the season as a whole, and to prepare for those last couple episodes. So when I've gone back to rewatch the show, some elements of those early episodes of the season where it does feel like they're moving through stories very fast, I'm not as bothered by as I feel I was on initial watch. I think a key example of that now is when the third episode first dropped, I remember thinking that's way too much story, that they're just going through way too fast. I actually feel a lot better about it now, and I think that the third episode is called Fire Made Flesh. I think it's one of my favorite episodes of the season now. If for no other reason than it's just freaking wild. And and like, I'm going to be saying this a lot because the animation is gorgeous, but oh my freaking God, the animation in that episode, everything with Madeline as the Goblin Queen, and and Sinister in his lair, and all that stuff. It's just out of this world. And by the way, I do want to take this time to be like, I'd love to ask Eric and Julia Lewald like how they feel about the quality of the animation that they're seeing on this show, because they of course are the showrunners on the OG series. And I've read most of Eric Lewald's book about making the original series, and the pain from his words that you can read about like getting the money for the animation studios, and and how the frustration, how saving the studios, saving money finally won out, on those like last 8 episodes or whatever, where the animation is just so far removed from the quality of earlier on. And
it's a real shame the way the final season it just falls off a cliff visually, doesn't it?
And so to see that now this show is getting made with the full support of Marvel and Disney, and and the 2 animation studios doing the work on it. It's predominantly Studio Mirror, and also I think it's called Tiger Animation, both Korean animation studios, and it's just top of the line work, and it's just so stunning. But speaking of the drop off in season 5 of the OG series, cracks me up because the finale episode, the version of Gyrick that we get in that looks nothing at all like Gyrick. And so when this show starts off and it's showing like court drawings of the scene, from the OG finale, and that looks like Gyrick, I'm like, we're getting a little bit revisionist animation to make up for it.
Well, we did see Gyrick earlier in the original '90s run, and
Yes,
he looked correct before that. They
yes.
just, for some reason, they decided to make him look like a completely different dude in the finale, which is odd, very odd.
Yeah, and I do want to say one more thing about the fact that Tiger Animation does 2 of the episodes, episodes 6 and 7, and I only just recently found that out. I thought it was Studio Mirror like throughout the entire season, just because everything looked so seamless. And like with the OG show, every time they switched to a different animation studio, it was a drastic difference. It just goes to show that when all the animation studios involved are actually like top of the line and you're putting a lot of money into it, like that does make a difference. So like I was just blown away by the quality of the animation. I thought it was breathtaking. So yeah, I'll probably say that like 50 more times, but
Yeah, well, I mean, you could single out individual aspects of that as well in terms of art design, in terms of like the way that motion is depicted, and also things like the cinematography of it all and the camera angles and fight choreography for that matter, which is the perfect photo to describe that. Yeah, it looks gorgeous in every episode. The X-Men have never looked this good, in my opinion.
yeah, no. Just absolutely incredible. So just like I don't know, this feels like a silly question to ask because we may all give the same answer, but did you guys have a favorite episode of the season?
I mean, I'll just say it. Episode 5. Episode 5, remember it, it's a masterpiece. If you allow me to consider the final 3 episodes as one episode in that kind of cheaping way, like, you know, Tolerance is Extinction parts 1, 2, and 3, that might be on the level because that there is some great stuff in there. But if we're just talking strictly one episode as aired, then yeah, it's Remember It. But Fire Made Flesh is also awesome, and frankly, like I think every episode has something to offer on that front. I'm sure we'll talk about kind of the strange structure of episode 4. That might be the one place where it was a little bit of a bump, but otherwise they're all like very distinct story units. But yeah, Remember It is this show's crowning achievement.
That was I said it to you at the time, I think, John. That was their Red Wedding episode. It felt like this was the one where it had people like jumping off of their couches and screeching at the TV, well, I think.
And I will say that this is actually surprisingly where I think I struggled the most this season, not in terms of like, I thought the episode was stunning and probably some of the best television I'd ever seen. But like, you know, this guys, it really killed me. It's like, I was just absolutely devastated. Sorry that this may be triggering for people watching the stream. Yeah, Gambit. Oh, and at the time we thought Magneto too. And
I didn't at the time either. I was like, Magneto is going to be
like
back.
The show did it about as well as it possibly could do without actually fooling us that Magneto was going to be gone.
I knew that Magneto would be back within the next couple of episodes, and also I was kind of expecting the stinger with Gambit at the end of the season, which maybe we'll talk about later. But
yes.
But yeah. But it was still a shocker. I don't know how well versed in Marvel comics you are, Jared, but I know, John, you were telling me that you were planning on having a read through of the X-Men comics after the show finishes.
Yeah, it's just about like every time I think I'm gonna have the time to start, it's like, oh god, but it's so much. When am I gonna?
It is a lot. It's just hard to know where to start. And you know, I've read a few comics in my time, but I haven't read read anything like, you know, the breadth of all of X-Men comics. There's some of the storylines they've adapted in this I'm familiar with, and some I'm not so much. But yeah, it's what was I going to say about this? Yeah, there's just like trying to predict what's going to happen based on the comics is kind of like, it's always just like a will they won't they kind of game, where it's like, I'm not sure whether they're going to do this in the same way or not. So Genosha in the comics also has a disaster like that, where it gets destroyed, thousands of mutants die, and it's a big horrible event. Actually, I should say, in the comics over the years, about every 10 to 20 years, something awful happens to all of the mutants on Earth. there's always something that happens that they have to shake up the entire X-Men sort of sub-universe of Marvel Comics. And this was one that happened around I think early 2000s. It was Grant Morrison's run on New X-Men, if I'm not mistaken. Which was a storyline called E is for Extinction. And in that version of the Genosha story, Genosha is destroyed by a giant Godzilla 3-headed kaiju sentinel, but it's not Bastion who is behind that in that storyline. It's actually Cassandra Nova, who will be the villain in the Wolverine and Deadpool movie that's coming out next month. So I was very much expecting to see her in this when that was set up, and I knew Genosha was doomed from the minute that they started building it up in episode 2. When as soon as they said, "Oh, we're thinking about letting Genosha into the UN," I was like, "Oh no, they're doing that."
Well, see, and actually, this is probably one of the virtues of me not being super well versed in the comics is that this stuff is still allowed to. You know, I'm able to have the rug pulled out from under my feet, because I actually like, and even if I thought that, like, well, first of all, I didn't think that, like, that wasn't really on my radar, the stuff that would happen. But even if it was, it wouldn't have been halfway through the season.
No, I wasn't expecting. I was expecting the end of the season as well at that point.
Yeah, well, it was so funny because when I was, I had to delay watching episode 5 because I usually like work all day on Wednesdays, so usually I don't have the opportunity to really watch stuff until later that night. So I had stayed off of social media and all that stuff. I was like, I don't want to know anything about any of these episodes. But I remember that week you were like, you said something like, you know, have the tissues nearby. And
but
like,
I know you.
and so, but I was watching the episode and I'm like, I remember reading like the description of the episode. I'm like, it doesn't seem like there's anything like that big going on this week. And then it got to like the Rogue Gambit stuff. I'm like, oh, and they're breaking up. Is this what Dan was talking about? But you know, it's just a sad romantic story this week. So when the attack happened, I was like, oh shit, this is what he was talking about. And then when it just got to the end, you know. You know, I can't feel you. Oh God, I was just completely bereft. And I think I responded to your I can't remember if you had a thread that week or not, but I just responded like holy fuck or something like that. Because I was in such a state of shock. And as for why I thought Magneto was dead, see, for me, I felt like the interviews about the episode did a good job of selling that they really wanted to make a statement with this, and that they weren't really, and they were bringing, like, they were saying, "Damn it, I'm Magneto," you know. So it, like, maybe if I had been more cynical, I would have seen it for like the Jon Snow act that it was, and that Magneto was actually going to be fun. But I thought they were really saying, and then I looked back at like his arc through the first 5 episodes, and I'm like, shit, is this like how he goes out, that he legitimately tried to turn over a new leaf, and then he, and then he goes out
Then
and the party doesn't
then he
stop.
goes back to the old leaf. In a way.
Yeah. But no, when I saw him, I was like, when I saw that he was still alive, I was like, yes. And I was like, oh no, he's gonna go back to how he is. But then by the end of the season, I think, we'll have to see what the dynamic between him and Charles is next season.
I'm tempted
But
to say this season was my favorite adaptation of Magneto of all time, and that's really saying something considering who played him in live action. But going back to favorite episodes, I think the one that I think I have 3 to be honest. But but the one that really like hooked me, and I was like, oh, I need to really pay attention to this show. Was episode 2. Just this scene with the UN and the trial and everything. That was also a comic storyline that they adapted. But just beautifully done. I loved his speech at the end so much.
no, it chills down my spine, and
great voice work for Magneto as well.
Yeah, it's not, it's not an exact match for. I'm trying to remember the voice actor's name, David Hemblin, I think, but it's very similar. I thought when the season started off, I thought he sounds a little more evil to me, but that's not how I felt by the end of the season. I thought like it's just such a wonderfully nuanced performance, and they really capitalized on the thing that I love so much about this iteration of Magneto in the animated series and now X-Men 97. It's that other, I feel like with the films, even though they do explore his friendship with Charles, he does seem to be more overtly a villain in the films. And I've always felt in the animated series, he's this guy that is responding to his trauma, but that he almost wants to believe in in Charles' dream, but he just can't. And that he almost sort of keeps. It's funny how often he keeps getting pulled into working with the X-Men in the animated series, to the point where I made a joke that he's barely a villain in the animated series.
I call him an anti-villain. I would say that's what he is. Maybe the archetypal anti-villain, arguably in this genre. Anyway, we talk a lot about anti-heroes, but Magneto is the villain that you root for. And understand, that he has this horrible past, which was never really touched on in the 90s show because they weren't allowed, which was obviously the Holocaust, which everybody knows about because of the live action now. And so we know that he was a victim of the Nazi, or his family were victims of the Nazis, and so that was sort of alluded to a little bit in the original show, but it was much more overt here, which I think was helpful because it really helps you understand the character better when you know that about him. This scene was cool as well. Actually, I really liked this. This was in Vietnam, wasn't it? I believe it was supposed to be.
Well, and it was great because we get to see this is very reminiscent of some of the stuff we saw in his first episode in the animated series. We get some flashbacks with him and Charles, and so it felt like going back to see something that was alluded to like all the way back, when I was a kid, but yeah, it was just so great to see that. But yeah, no, I adored his characterization in this because it just, and Magneto has always been for me just one of the most fascinating characters in fiction, and a big part of that was because of his characterization in the animated series. and I was very happy to see, you know, that continue on here, to that it felt like the same character, and that they were taking it even further, and just. I was a mess with all the stuff with him and Charles in the final episode, and you know, their friendship is just, you know, that's been one of the best parts of any X-Men adaptation. You know, like even the lesser Fox films, like more often than not, one of the things I could point to, and I said, you know, well, that was still a good part of the movie. You know, it was usually Charles and Eric.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts, Jared?
Yeah, no, it was fascinating to see this take on Magneto, because again, as someone who really became entrenched with following the X-Men by following the live action version of the role, Sir Ian McKellen is just, he is the person you would want Magneto to play Magneto in live action, and he just absolutely crushed the role, even in the films, as you say, John, that perhaps were not as successful overall. And, you know, but Magneto has such a rich history that it is refreshing to see that, like, oh yeah, no, there doesn't just have to be one definitive adaptation. We can explore the character's psychology in this fascinating way. And in particular, the thing that I found most intriguing was like the thing that formed the big stinger to the end of, I believe, the first trailer, which was the idea that after his presumed death, Charles Xavier would trust Magneto with his X-Men, would kind of bequeath them to him, and in the hopes that he could, you know, not only find a better path, but as he also says, give a chance for Scott and Jean to live their life. And I like, it's kind of played as like a sinister, woohoo, what's going to happen next at the end of the first episode. But then when the way that Magneto actually responds to that is fascinating, because you, like, based on thinking of him more in the classical villain sense, you're thinking, A, what the hell was Xavier thinking? That's certainly what Cyclops is thinking. And two, oh, how long is it going to be until he tries to do some dastardly plot with this? But he doesn't, you know, until the climactic events of episode 5 and the kind of the tragedy of Genosha kind of set him back on kind of his original mindset. He actually seems committed to trying to walk the walk, even when he's tested, as he is in episode 2, when the UN puts him on trial. And I loved seeing, like, the idea that, like, this guy actually is trying to be better, as he says. And I had never expected the show to do that with the character, and I thought it was a brilliant choice. And I also, as I alluded to, introducing the rogue element to it all, like the relationship that the two of them had, like, I thought it was actually brilliant, like the way that they kind of wove that in. And obviously it becomes a source of tension between Rogue and Gambit, and a recurring element throughout the season. But I just thought that their dynamic was great. You know, it was a kind of thing, like it was kind of been hinted at in the movies and in the and it obviously has its roots in the comics. But like over time, at first I was like, did I miss something? But then I was like, oh no, actually these characters are very well matched, and I found their relationship fantastic. That was a reason that I, even before the climactic events of episode 5, I was just finding that episode so engrossing. The idea that this Genosha would choose Magneto to lead them, and that he would want Rogue to rule with him, obviously because he has romantic interest in her and she has feelings for him as well, but also just because he recognizes her strength and the value that she would offer. And it was like, and I was believing it. I was buying it, even as my heart was breaking for poor Remy over there. I was like, I can see how this could work. And then of course Rogue, you know, it seems like was going to actually pull away from that before tragedy kind of makes that choice for them. But I thought that the relationship between Rogue and Magneto was honestly one of the highlights of the first half of the season. And it was also just, as a related sidebar, just it's cool to see this version of Rogue, because I do think that in the live action films, like as great as Anna Paquin's performance is, like for one, like I forgot Rogue can fucking fly. that was just cool to see again.
Yeah, no, this is, yeah, I like, I don't want to say anything bad about, Anna Paquin's, version. It's not her fault that, that Rogue has, the powers that she, which, and there's a very good reason for that, because, there's a whole story about, Rogue and Miss Marvel, but still, like, this is the Rogue I remember, from when I was a kid, and it's like, yeah, it's it's just great to have this version of the character back.
It's interesting that they decided to go in this direction. I mean, Jared, you mentioned that they their relationship has roots in the comics, Rogue and Magneto, that is. But it's quite a small storyline. That it's quite a fleeting storyline in the comics. It's not something that is like a long-standing relationship that they have. There's history, but there's not. But it was a fling in the comics, really, and so they played that up a lot here in an interesting way, which took me by surprise.
I
would say, sorry, Gambit and Rogue are one of the more stable couples when it comes to superheroes in general, and especially the X-Men. Cyclops and Jean give it a good try, but she keeps dying, so that gets in the way. And then, Gambit and Rogue are dorps, really, aren't they? Like, they're the best couple. But the storyline where they get married in the comics is just beautiful. It's one of my favorites.
Well, I mean, and that should have been one of the signs that, like, somebody was doomed, because you always play up the drama, right? Right before something terrible happens. I will say, I was not expecting to like this storyline, like when it was, first kind of hinted at in like the second episode. I was like, I don't know how I feel about this, but I actually ended up really liking it a lot.
I had concerns when they introduced this idea, because I was a little worried that they would make Gambit jealous and unlikable because of his jealousy. I thought that he might be that guy, but he handled it very well, actually, in episode 5, and we saw how mature he was, actually, which is a side to Gambit that you don't always see. So I thought that was well handled. And then, of course, what happens to him happens, and it sets us up for a greater tragedy because of that. It's it really was. It was a big part of the heart of the storyline of the first half of the season.
And one thing I did want to say is that is something that it was really affecting about episode 5, and I, like, cursed under my breath when I went back to rewatch the series, because I was like, those mother effers, they planted the seed in episode 1, which was the use of the song, the Ace of Base's Happy Nation in right before Hell is Unleashed. It covers over Rogue and Magneto's dance, and it just makes everything like feel like, like everything is, sort of blissful, in the moment before Hell's Unleashed. And now, of course, it's really haunting. But they actually have that lightly playing under Jean's vision in the first episode. And it's not something, unless maybe if you know the song, which of course I don't, because you guys know me. But when you go back and watch that, it's like, shit. And that's why, like, it is like the Reigns of Castamere. So, very much Red Wedding echoes. God. that episode is just like I've watched it. I've watched it about 3 times now, and every time it still just destroys me. It's and now like after the first time I watched it, I was like, it was too painful to think about revisiting it for me. But now I can watch it and I can just be like, yes, it's terribly sad, but also like just cinematically, it's so beautiful and so astonishing. I really do. I know that they've submitted that episode for they're going to
Emmy,
submit
yeah.
that for the Emmys, so hopefully it wins. So
Yeah, is that an animated Emmy? I think.
Yeah.
I think I read that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. It also, episode 5, just while we're gushing about it, it also has my single favorite line of the entire season, even though there are great lines in every episode, which is the conversation that Gambit has with Nightcrawler, and when he's talking about their relationship with Rogue and why he should, whether or not he should, ask her to marry him, and Gambit's basically like, no white picket fence life for me, I'm like, we don't get that, we're too busy sinning. And then Nightcrawler says, quote, "There is no love without sin, for love is best measured in what we forgive." When I heard that, I was like, God damn, that is a good line for the animated for this show. And it's like, and honestly, I think it could be argued it's one of the major themes of the season, because given all the hurt that all these characters inflict upon each other and that the world inflicts upon them, and then some of them try to inflict upon the world, like, there is no way forward without that idea that, love is measured in what we forgive.
Which, by the way, like, I just think it's so great that, like, Nightcrawler comes in episode 5, and then he takes, like, over the emotional, all the emotional weight, like, is sort of because of him. He really does a great job at driving home, a lot of the themes of the series, and he becomes like instantly one of the most important characters.
They killed it with Nightcrawler. He has some great speeches in several of the later episodes. So I really like his eulogy as well. I can't think of any quotes from it at the moment, but yeah, they did some wonderful work with him in having him with the dialogue, and bringing out his religious aspects of his character, but also how they used him in fights was wonderful as well. And we've seen Nightcrawler done really, really well in the opening scene of X2 as well. But this was special because they did things with him that you can't really do in live action in this.
I mean, just look at how this is animated, like, and the music over this scene too. They knocked it out of the park with the music. You just overall, of course, besides the main theme, which of course was always going to be great. But I was really impressed with the Newton brothers did the score for the series, and I just thought so much of it was great, especially a lot of music for Magneto, Storm. Just I mean, when Storm comes out of the cave, in her splendor, and that classic, Storm outfit, and it's just great, and the music is soaring, and it's and I will say one of the things that had been rumored throughout the season, and they did kind of bring it to fruition by the end of the season, was that they were going to be doing something with the uniforms, and I thought it was kind of cool to not only because of course they're classic uniforms from that era of the comics, which a lot of these stories are taken from, but also it was very reminiscent for me of, I don't know if you guys ever saw the animated pilot for an earlier version of X-Men, which was called Pride of the X-Men.
Yeah, it was Kitty Pryde centered, wasn't it? Shadowcat, who still hasn't appeared in this version of the X-Men, although she was on the wall of people that Forge had in the final episode that we saw. So maybe we'll see her next season. But
so a lot of the designs, that they use, obviously some of these characters didn't appear in that, but a lot of this felt very reminiscent to the style of costumes of Pride of the X-Men. Like that's exactly the uniform that Scott was in that Nightcrawler and Storm, and it just like, and the fact that they were fighting it out on Asteroid M, which also happens in Pride of the X-Men, it just like, so for me it did feel like a nod to that. And
I'm aware of that show, but I was thinking about the comic book counterparts of those uniforms. I've always preferred actually Wolverine in his brown costume. I think he looks cooler in the brown yellow costume than he does in the yellow blue costume. But
hard disagree there. It's
an unpopular opinion. I'm aware of that, but yeah, I don't know. It just works for me.
That's why it's like, it's nice for an homage, but I'm really hoping to see those 90s costumes return.
I think we will.
Whenever they get back to the present. At least, I don't know, maybe they'll keep the Storm's look, because that feels very done on purpose. But like, for me, I'd much rather see, especially like Scott and Wolverine, go back to their 90s looks, but we'll see. You did touch on episode 2, which I did want to say, like, you said that for you, like, Magneto's speech and in that scene was really great.
Yeah.
And like I just, that just blew me away so much, because it just, like, I was just so happy to see that from Magneto. And so much of that is that anger from Magneto of like getting out those things that he wants to say to them, bigot, sycophant, and there was a time when I would smite you all for what was done to Storm, but a friend has challenged me. It's that whole speech was just so great. And then when it caps off with, I am trying to be better. Please do not make me let you down. It's
the double entendre of that while they're in the outer atmosphere is just hilarious and very on point.
And then of course, like, just the the sort of symmetry of the fact that that's like the whole, all the imagery of that sequence is like hinting towards all the Asteroid M stuff later in the season, which is just so great. But then the other
sorry, can I just interrupt 1 second? I love the moment when the sort of the stage first gets uprooted by Magneto and lifts off, and he goes crashing through the ceiling, and Beast is like, oh dear.
There are so many times like when that's his reaction, and I just love that it punctuates so many like dramatic, and the fact that the season ends when they meet.
That's all I need is Beast quoting like Tennyson and stuff like that, and just like his little one-liners. He was there for just to be a quote machine, really. Just as Morph was there to be a cameo machine.
Which, by the way, I have to say, like, I'm so happy that like Morph finally gets his due with this show, and that he's a solid member of the team, now. And
do we say he or they or either for Morph? What is the
sorry, did I say
pronoun?
he?
You did.
Okay.
They said they in the show,
They,
but I think in
it's
interviews the writers said, you know, he is fine too. I think that was the sort of implication that I've heard.
I do apologize for that. It's the only thing is for me, I went so many years.
Well, he was he in the original show,
Yeah,
and they are they in this, or at least Rogue said they at one point. So
yeah, so but in this show, it's they, because regardless of what I know, the writers directors may have said something,
they've said some
but within
conflicting things.
yeah, but within the context of the actual show, it is they. So so I think that's what we would stick with there. But yeah. But yeah, just so great to see Morph get their due, because I've been such a massive fan of the character, going all the way back to Night of the Sentinels, and especially when they brought Morph back for in season 2 of the OG show, and to see him going through all that, or see them going through all that, and so to see the character not only being a mainstay in the show, but also part of the opening credits too. It was just really a joy to see.
Yeah, because correct me if I'm wrong, isn't Morph actually an original character for the X-Men animated show?
Sort of.
Yeah, I know that they were inspired.
It's based on a comic book character called Changeling, who was quite a minor character, but they had to change the name for like copyright reasons.
Yeah. No, but for instance, Morph is one of the characters in this show who did not appear in the live action movies. So it is nice to see them get their due back where they originally started, and yeah, as we joked, this is how we get our Juggernaut cameo, because otherwise Juggernaut's not in the season, but otherwise, but it is like, obviously Morph has their own arc throughout the show as well, and it's, I actually did think that they might play up a bit more of his connection with Sinister and the Sentinels. I kind of thought that got a little bit lost, but that's okay. The show was juggling a lot, as we said, and it's and it also is like, again, coming from the perspective of the live action shows, when I just had ingrained in my mind like shape-shifting mutant, that's Mystique, but it's basically, it was nice to actually come back and see like, oh no, there's more than one, and Morph is they're a funny character. Let's say, they get a lot.
There are several characters who have that similar ability of shapeshifting, but it tends to vary in terms of like how many of the character who they're shifting into, how many of their abilities do they get, and what is the limit of that. And so I have questions about Morph, because at one stage they turn into Quicksilver, and they have Quicksilver's speed, and I'm like, can he do anything? Like, what is the limit to that? Like, surely they're the most powerful member of the team. They can do anything in theory. Like, what is the limit to that? I'm not understanding. He turns into the Hulk at one point, and I'm like, why don't you just do that every fight? Just be the Hulk. Turn into Gladiator. We saw Gladiator in episode 6. He's one of the strongest characters in Marvel.
Okay, which, by the way, I have to say, like, I want to say this before we take a very quick break for the mid-roll. Like, one of my, and this is sort of me riding on the MCU a little bit, but you gotta allow me my little bit.
I know what you're gonna say. I don't agree, but you can say it.
No, but it was just so great to see, like, something that is so exclusively like X-Men, you know, and like the Shi'ar Empire, like coming in and just completely obliterating the Kree, and like, and just like Ronan ain't shit.
Yeah, the
You know,
Guardians of the Galaxy had a real problem with him in live action.
Yeah.
Deathbird just.
and so yeah, I got a little bit of pleasure out of that.
There was me watching that scene and thinking, like, back in the 90s, if they'd done this would have been a deep cut reference, having Ronan the Accuser, and now everybody knows who that is because Guardians of the Galaxy. But so that was my thoughts on that very quickly. But.
Yeah, I thought, John, I thought you were going to reference your tweet where you were basically glorifying in the fact that you're like, this show proves that the Avengers are useless. And I'm like, I don't agree. I do not agree. I do not endorse that position. But what I will say is that one of the just small joys of the show was actually seeing, just as I'm sure you also appreciated, the full scope of the Marvel universe on screen together for the first time in this way. Because in addition to the mutants, you know, seeing Captain America, seeing the Hulk, even if it was Morph impersonating him, seeing Black Panther, seeing Daredevil, seeing freaking Cloak and Dagger showed up, and then of course Spider-Man. You know, this is the kind of thing that like they can now do because they now have the rights to all these characters. And you know, we don't need to relitigate the fact that part of the reason the Avengers rose to prominence was because Marvel Disney didn't have the rights to the X-Men and Spider-Man because they'd sold those rights off. But for all the trials that it went through, like now those rights are all back under one roof, save Spidey kind of, and they can now, you know, if they want to have Captain America and Rogue have a conversation, they can do it. It's pretty cool.
I really enjoyed Rogue lobbing his shield into a friggin' mountain. That was epic. I was laughing for about 5 minutes when they did that.
I will say that even as I poke fun at the Avengers, which by the way, Iron Man can't even be troubled to open his damn mouth and say something. But you know, no, but I'm joking there because what I'm actually going to say here is I actually really loved getting to see these characters in their classic appearances. You know, back to these sort of looks of the 90s animated shows, and even though even though my memories of the Iron Man animated series are not fond, although I'm sure I enjoyed it perfectly well when I was a kid, but I feel no desire to go back and revisit it. But the looks of those characters I really enjoy, and there is just something about doing these Marvel characters in animation that I just think is so great because you don't have to try and, you know, modify them for live action. And like, how would this, you know, look in a more realistic setting? You can just, you know, do the characters as they are in the comics. But no, you knew I had to, like, I wasn't even gonna bring it up yet. But like you knew I had to at least tweet about that and make have some fun with that.
I know you did, and we're all well aware of the, you know, you like to poke fun at the MCU, and I used to let you have your fun, but I was kind of like, I'm just gonna let that one go by because, you know, these characters, like, they operate in different realms. It was actually, I was a fan of the way, for instance, that they used Captain America to say that, like, he wants to do things by the book because he is still in this iteration, you know, working for the U.S. government, and it's kind of he's not just there for fun. He's there to show that, like, oh, Rogue is like fully intent on like doing whatever the hell she has to do to bring Trask and the Sentinels to justice, and perhaps she might be missing the bigger picture because she's so focused and blinded by her rage. So yes, it was cool to see her throw his shield into the far mountains, but I don't think that means that Steve Rogers is useless. I think that means that he was trying to do things a way that was probably not going to get it done in this particular.
Well, no, and I will say, like, that comment had a lot more to do with the fact that, for me, once the X-Men are involved,
yeah,
like, most of the other characters just fall by the wayside. It's like, why do you need Captain America and, you know, Iron Man when you have the X-Men? So that's just a bias that I have from growing up in the 90s with, you know.
Coming from a comics perspective, there's a lot of overlap between the two, but they've also come into conflict a lot in the comic books as well. I mean, Beast is an Avenger. Like, Beast joined the Avengers and was an Avenger for a long time because they sort of didn't know what to do with the character and figured give him a shot in a different team, see what happens. I guess you could argue Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch as well. I mean, they were originally Magneto's children, and they were villains, and then they rebelled, and then they kind of disappeared and ended up being in the second iteration of the Avengers. So there's a lot of crossover actually when you look at the comics and stuff.
Was Wolverine an Avenger at one point?
He much later became an Avenger, yeah.
Okay.
But only more in the 2000s, really, he was known for being an Avenger. But that was more just because he was one of their sort of like big characters, and they thought that's our flagship team, so let's have one of our biggest characters in that team. Same thing for Spider-Man. You know, he was always a loner character back in the day, but as he, you know, became popular, they figured, let's get some sales out of this popular character and put him in our biggest team. But there was a big storyline in like the 2010s, I think, I want to say, that they did, which was Avengers versus X-Men, which was a storyline that kind of came about with I don't want to get too bogged down into the details of the plot, but the Avengers and the X-Men fight over basically the Phoenix coming back, and Cyclops actually has kind of a villain arc in that storyline, so that would be interesting to adapt. I don't know how they would get there from this version of Cyclops in this, but
I was going to say, nah, I don't see it.
No, they probably won't do that, and I don't want that much Avengers stuff. It's cool for them all to be in the same universe, but I want this to focus on the X-Men and that family dynamic.
Yeah.
As opposed to the Avengers, which is the Avengers is like, it's a team, but it's not a family like the way the X-Men is, and that's one of the things I love about it. And that's why you get that soap opera dynamic to a different level.
And I will, to be serious about, like, I do kind of like the way that the 90s animated shows kind of did it, which was that there was an acknowledgement of the larger world, and, you know, in the Spider-Man show, you know, the X-Men do appear for like a two-part crossover, but it was never like overdone. It's like, yes, these things exist in the same world, but if you're watching X-Men, it's about the X-Men. If you're watching Spider-Man, it's about Spider-Man, you know, and so I kind of like the way they did it this season, where they did acknowledge that stuff, but it wasn't like, you know, the stars here are definitely the X-Men. Okay, so let's just pause really quick. We'll do this mid-roll quickly because so a lot to discuss. So Jared, we've established a schedule moving forward, and we actually know what we're going to be doing. Next week, we're going to be turning back over to Star Wars, continuing our prequel coverage, and we're going to be talking about Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones.
Yep.
Which is going to be interesting after all of our Bad Batch coverage. You know, to look back at that film. I joked last week about looking forward to, you know, Obi-Wan and his excellent poker face with the Kaminoans. And so that's going to be a lot of fun. Then the week after that, what did we settle on? We talked about Emma, right?
Yeah, so we had been debating whether or not we were wanted to cover Star Wars: The Acolyte, which will be having its 2-episode premiere, but we thought that might be a lot of Star Wars. So unless that show absolutely knocks our socks off and we just can't wait, we're gonna probably be doing the 2020 version of Emma, starring Anya Taylor-Joy, that week.
Which there's going to be some crossover because on Tuesday I'm going to see Furiosa. So the only crossover there being the actress. That's like the limit of the crossover there.
It's a good crossover. She's a great actress.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
And then we'll finish with the prequel trilogy with Revenge of the Sith the following week, and then from there.
And then we'll let you guys know what's coming up after that. Dan, I know you have been, kind of easing back from, doing stuff on YouTube. But do you have anything you wanted to plug? Or?
Extended hiatus, yeah. I mean, no, I don't have anything to plug. Yeah, for those who may be watching who don't know me, I have a channel on the Lord of the Rings, primarily the books, and actually, if anything, primarily the Silmarillion, called Voice of Geekdom, which, yeah, has been inactive for a long time now, well over a year now. So nothing new to plug. I am slowly working on things here and there behind the scenes and hoping to make a comeback at some point, but life has gotten more complicated in the last couple of years, so things have sort of changed for me, and I'm hoping to get back to it, but no real news on that at the moment. But yeah, it'd be nice to make some new content in the future. I have things that are half finished that I need to release still, actually, to be honest. So yeah, maybe at some point, but I have no news. So.
I can definitely say, speaking from my own experiences, that extended hiatuses are not a bad thing. Because sometimes they're required. But I will say, for if anybody has not checked out Dan's channel, there might not be any new stuff on there, but if you haven't, like I said, if you haven't checked out his channel before, hop on there and take a look at the videos that he did, because they're absolutely extraordinary. So
I expect there will be new content in the future eventually, but I just don't know when at the moment. I guess I should plug one thing, which is my fiance's podcast, which is The Gilmore Way, which is about the Gilmore Girls TV show. Which, if you enjoy that show, make sure you check that out. They work very hard on that and come out with something every week, and been doing it for quite a while now. So really proud of Kate and Laura. Have done some stellar work and continue to do so. So yeah, I'll just give that a little plug.
I can second that, even though I haven't been able to sit down and watch the show, but I have watched a number of their episodes, and the thing I can say is, even having not watched the show, their conversations are always extraordinarily entertaining, and they do a great job, and they're really about talking about the themes of episodes, so that it's not just about the content of the episodes themselves. It's it's about more than that. So both Voice of Geekdom and The Gilmore Way, please check out both of those, because they're both really great channels. And because I saw, Dan, that you just mentioned the chat, and I don't think Jared and I ever do this, which is hilarious. But if you haven't liked the stream yet today, please do so. And also, if you're watching and you're not yet subscribed to our channel, we'd love if you would. We never ask that, because apparently we don't like it when our channel grows. But but it sure would be nice. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive back into X-Men 97. The only other thing that I wanted to say, kind of about the first half of the season is I did want to talk briefly about episode 4, which is still like the part of the season that I struggle with a little bit because from what I understand, what I've kind of read from Bo DeMeo, who wrote most of the first season and was the showrunner for season 1, that episode 4 was intended to be like to run as like a standard episode, cutting back and forth between the two storylines. But then Marvel decided that in their opinion, that it would work better if the two stories were separate. And I kind of get that because tonally they're very different. But I do think the side effect of that is that neither one really feels whole to me. They feel very abbreviated, and maybe if they were cut together, that maybe they might feel more substantial, as a single piece. But I don't know. We won't know now. But it's kind of, for me, I don't dislike it. I just feel like, especially in the case of the first part of Life Death, I was left wanting more because I feel like they could have devoted more time to that. But yeah, it's pretty much my only sort of, not even really a negative, but I think it's the weak point of the season.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I think that every single episode has something to offer in terms of its themes and its character work. And I actually did enjoy elements of episode 4 quite a bit. But if I was going to pick what I thought was probably my least favorite episode of the season, it would probably be episode 4. And I think part of it, you mentioned that it's kind of like effectively divided into two halves. I actually have like kind of different, being it's split into two halves. There were actually kind of like different things that kind of rubbed me the wrong way about the episode. With the first half of, Jubilee and Sunspot dealing with Mojo in the video game world, that I actually liked it as a way to kind of give us a little bit more character work and deepen the relationship between Jubilee and Sunspot. It was cool to see like the construct. Obviously, Mojo is kind of a very distinctive and not the most appealing villain visually, but that's the point. But it was fun. It felt a little bit more disconnected from the overall, story. And it was kind of just more of like a side adventure, like you might have seen in a previous episode. And I ultimately think, I'm not just going to say that this was exactly the point, but my overwhelming takeaway from that half of the story was, the theme of it is like Jubilee is very much like, I just want to play video games and relive all the past adventures. And then her older version of herself tells her, actually, no, we can't do that. This is not going to be the way these things go. You need to grow up and evolve. And then the next week we got Remember It. And I was like, oh, that's a little meta, is it not?
Well, and side note, I do want to say that it was really cool that the older version of Jubilee was played by Alison Court, who voiced Jubilee in the original series. So that was one of the things I really enjoyed.
They offered her old job back, actually, and she refused to take it because she wanted an Asian actress to play the role, which I think is super cool of her, and very understandable.
Yeah, and I actually really liked that aspect of that half of the episode. It was just it is a little bit of a tonal departure, but I still think it works, again, primarily to deepen the relationship between Jubilee and Sunspot, and which is actually a key development from the first episode. And then the second half of the episode, Life Death Part 1, it improved for me in retrospect once we got the rest of the story in Life Death Part 2, but it did feel a little bit sudden in just this isolated part of it. In particular, I know that there were visual clues about exactly how much time was passing with like the moon and things. I think you mentioned, John, but at first it seemed like Forge just appeared out of nowhere, and then 7 minutes later he's professing his undying love for Storm, and I'm like, this seems like it's happening suddenly. Of course, most of us would fall in love with Storm immediately, but we might.
Yep.
I've
been in love with Storm since I was about 6 years old, so yeah.
Yep.
I will say, I
actually thought that. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but I actually, once I saw the rest of the story with what they were doing with the adversary and how it ties into the fact that Storm lost her powers and perhaps there was actually more holding her back than she originally, was letting on. I thought that worked very well. It's just that I thought the story paid off in episode 6, and this episode 4 was kind of the setup in this part.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, again, if the two stories had like cut back and forth, we might have gotten a better sense of like time in between the moments in life death, but then it's totally so different that maybe that wouldn't have really worked either. It's one of those things where I feel like
well, they should have been separate episodes. That's the answer.
Yeah. I just think if they had a couple more episodes in the season to kind of flesh out some of these subplots, because everything involving like the main overarching storyline with that leads to Bastion and the Sentinels and all that stuff, all that was like really well paced and great. It did feel like they kind of squeezed in some of these other ideas, not to the point where like I said, originally I was feeling like I would have liked episode 3 to maybe be a 2-parter or something, but now I watch that episode and I'm like, okay, I'd still take a 2-parter, but also I watch it and I'm like, no, this is actually a really great episode. It's just one of those things where it's 10 episodes and they had a lot of stories and ideas they wanted to get across, and so I'm not going to be super critical when so much of the season was done so amazingly well.
Mini episodes within episodes like that have been done really well at times in other shows. I'm thinking of that one episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender where they Iroh and oh my gosh, names. Damn it. Why am I blanking on his name? Zuko. Iroh and Zuko open a tea shop together. That episode where he pushes him into going on a date and everything, and that's like a mini arc within the, and they have like separate episodes within the episode. That episode is like one of my favorite episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is a fantastic show as well. And so I've seen that done really well. So I was kind of on board with the concept of having a mini episode or 2 mini episodes within a 30-minute episode. But there was a jarring gap between tone in the 2 parts, and I think that's why they did that. But I think they should have been separate episodes and just build up the relationship more, and maybe get into. I think with the Storm life death storyline, the demon wasn't very well explained. We didn't really we gather that it was connected with Forge's backstory, but we didn't really get into Forge's backstory at all. We didn't really. I mean, obviously he's from a native background, so we can gather that much. So there's some Native American mysticism stuff going on, and I guess you guys probably picked up on that. But like,
well, I also felt like it was rooted in Storm as well, because you actually see the adversary first when she loses her powers.
Actually, at the UN.
Yeah, above her.
Okay, I didn't realize
that's the first time it appears. So so yeah, there's a lot to infer there, but like not like solid answers. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's one of those things where like I I feel the same way. It's like if they had been two separate episodes, we would have gotten to flesh out ideas in both of them. But that's it. There's still a lot that I enjoy about it. Episode 4, and then episode 5 happened, and I was like, "Oh my god!" So yeah, I'm fine with it. Like I said, it's not something that like brings things down too much or anything like that.
One concern that I think you voiced to me early on, John, was like that this show feels different tonally to the 90s show, and that it feels like it's for people who were kids in the 90s and have grown up to be adults like we have. And that it's not what you thought you were getting, I think, is sort of the phrase that you said to me. And so the Mojo episode is the most similar to the 90s show that this show gets, I think, in terms of tone.
Well, and when I said that, I was reeling from the heartache of episode 5. So I actually feel differently now because I think I was wanting to have my cake and eat it too when I said that, which was I wanted the show to, to have grown up a bit, because I'm not a little kid anymore. So I did want to see these characters, kind of go through some more stuff. But also I think at that moment I was feeling like, but I didn't want it to go that far in that direction. But then once I got over that, I was like, I really enjoyed what the show did with evolving the storytelling and taking the characters to places that they just couldn't have done in the original series. So yeah, most of what I was saying was coming from a place of like grief over. And at the time, in my mind, it was both Gambit and Magneto, and like if I had known that Magneto was actually still around, at that time, I think I wouldn't have made those comments, but I was a sucker, and I had believed that they had taken Magneto from me. But no, I'm actually very happy with what they did with the show tonally, and it's and especially like the stuff I mentioned before with Charles and Magnus, and especially in the last episode, sort of emotionally what they go through. It's just so great to be able to see that kind of drama delivered with these characters in a way that was in the original show. All the stuff they did was great for the little kid that I was, but it's great to watch this now and feel like the storytelling has evolved with these characters, with this version of these characters. It's just like pretty much, heartache of losing certain characters aside. It's pretty much what I, would have dreamed of for years and years. Like, and I never would have dreamed that I'd get these characters back. And to have them treated, with the care and respect that we're seeing in this show. So, and I will say another thing that I think I was sort of reeling from was the fact that I hadn't at that time done a full rewatch of the original series, and so I think I kind of wanted a grown-up experience of the original animated show all over again, because I hadn't watched the original show in a while. And the fact of the matter is that this is a continuation of that series. So once I did do a rewatch, and I had gone through and watched Gambit for 5 seasons of that show, and then gotten to that point and remember it. I was like, okay, no, this is a moment that's earned. It's heartbreaking, but it's earned, and yeah. So
as a general rule of thumb, if a character dies in the X-Men universe, there's probably a good chance you'll see them again at some point. So,
okay,
something to bear in mind when it comes to the sort of contrived melodrama of characters dying in comic books in general, but especially in X-Men.
At least for this season, he's a goner.
Yes, for now. Yeah. Do you want to know like what's?
No.
I mean, you can kind of figure out where they're going with it with the scene at the post credit scene.
I just don't know exactly how they're going to do it, but
the way they'll do it, the way that the comics did it, probably. Because
don't go there. If I end up reading it myself in the comics before the next season comes out, that's one thing. But otherwise, yeah, just leave me in the dark for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would like to talk a little bit about what might be coming up in the future, but we can.
Let's dive into sort of the latter half of the show. Once Bastion gets involved. Now, this is actually the one part that I wondered if you had gotten lost at all, Jared, because this the entire Bastion storyline kind of refers back to a two-parter in the original series called One Man's Worth, which kind of like I guess they kind of explain it vaguely in the series, but you have a lot more context for like how what Nimrod was doing in the past, and because it's a whole plot line involving an assassin going back to try and kill Professor Xavier before he really becomes Professor X, and then Bishop and an alternate version of Storm and Wolverine go back to save him, and Nimrod follows them back, and so that's how the Sentinel Nimrod ends up there, and we're told in this series that then he infected the Bastion's father, and that's how that whole thing starts. So I don't know if you felt like you got the what had actually happened to Bastion, or if it felt a little confusing to you.
It actually didn't.
Okay.
It felt perhaps the technical details of exactly what Nimrod was and how he came back, and like how he infected the Bastion's father, and then created this essentially human sentinel hybrid, bent on mutant extinction. Like I could have gotten lost in the how, but I didn't, because for a couple reasons. One, because the why of it was clear. Basically, from the moment this series was set up, I've been wondering who this apocalyptic threat was going to be, because it kind of felt like we were burning through a lot of the major possible villains that we would go to. It's like, it seems like Magneto's going to be on the side of right here. We have Gyrick behind bars. Yes, Mr. Sinister's out there, but it seems like they've got a handle on him. They've already taken care of Bolivar Trask. I'm sure there's more galactic threats out there. Like obviously there's the Shi'ar Empire and everything. And I'm just like, but this apocalyptic vision that Jean is having, like, it seems to be tied back to the Sentinels in some way. So I have a feeling that's going to come back. And they were talking about Master Mold and everything. And so when we got the reveal of one, like Trask being a human Sentinel hybrid, like an early experiment, and it ties in also to the work that Mr. Sinister was doing in episode 3, trying to infect Nathan Summers with that organo-techno virus. And then there's something coming back from the future. By the time we got to Bastion and the reveal of who and what he was, I'm like, this all makes sense. This all ties back to the idea that, like, okay, this guy has been the mastermind the entire time. And everything, all the villain stuff that we've been seeing throughout this series, with the possible exception of like the adversary and Mojo from episode 4, all of this has been effectively Bastion's doing. And so thematically, it made perfect sense. And yes, in the episode itself, they kind of give us the quick and dirty version of like how this guy came to be. And I will note that well, I didn't rewatch the entire series. Bo DeMeo, the showrunner, had put out a list of episodes. So he's like, you should watch these episodes. And the one man's worth, what two-parter was on it. And he had also specifically mentioned that if back in that original episode, you can actually see the characters who would become Bastion's mother and father in that episode, and he points them out. They're kind of like background extras, like his mom is the waitress and his dad is one of the guys who assists Wolverine in the fight. And I'm like, that's cool. That's that. But like, that's the kind of thing that I was able to go read an explainer article afterwards. Watching the show itself, I thought just like, it makes sense that this guy would be the villain, and all the other villains we've seen are tied to him in some way and reporting to him, because they're all ultimately serving his goal, which is the extermination of mutant kind. And specifically, that, you know, you talk about great villain speeches. This guy's got some really like amazing ones, but really it all boils down to the line that Gyrick says in the first episode and the title of the 3-part finale. The idea of tolerance is extinction. That is such a thematically powerful and chilling idea, obviously, because we see elements of that from certain bad actors in the real world as well. And so it all made sense to me in that way. And because it was emotionally true, I could figure out the technical details with it.
That's good. That makes me feel good, because that was the only part where I was like, oh, gee, this feels like it's really tied back to, you know, a complicated plot in the in the original series. So I'm glad to hear that that you didn't feel lost or anything with that.
I would have thought that would have been more confusing for people that may not remember or haven't watched the original show. If they had tried to provide more exposition, it would have been more confusing. It was almost like the mystery kind of made it work. In this case, I think.
Yeah, no, and it's funny because I was curious too about like who the quote unquote big bad of the season was going to be. And I didn't really know anything about Bastion, but then as soon as he came on screen, I was like, okay, I don't know the character by name, but I recognize this guy from X-Men comics of the era. Because even though I wasn't a big reader of X-Men comics, I loved going to the comic book store and just looking at all the covers and stuff. And so I did recognize the character design.
And he debuted around the time that the original cartoon was out, I think. So
yeah. So that was really cool, just to kind of be in the dark and like not know, you know, not be familiar with the villain who was ultimately getting introduced. And I loved it because it was just, and it felt really personal, because it was about, you know, this kid who kind of grew up suffering and like being confused, and who ultimately gets turned, you know, gradually into a monster. And I just love at his end, it's like, you know, that line of, I massacre you and you're trying to recruit me.
Yeah, I liked that they sort of explored this idea of, was it nature or nurture that what was the reason why he turned out like that. And I think it was, in the end, it was probably nurture. I think it was bad parenting that made him turn out to be a megalomaniac, from the sounds of it. I mean, the X-Men tried, but it seems like as a kid, his mother denied that he would have that opportunity to learn from Xavier, and things could have been very different. So it's quite sad, really. That's how hatred spreads, unfortunately, in the real world, and that's that allegory for you that I was talking about at the top of the stream.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea that Bastion, even though he's not like a true like natural mutant, he has his abilities from this futuristic organo-techno-virus, but he could have found a home with the X-Men. You know, Xavier would have taken him, absolutely. In fact, he offered him that chance, and his mom basically denied that opportunity. It sounds like out of a bit of fear, but also probably a bit of bigotry. You know, she basically just closed off that opportunity, and then it becomes, as you said, Dan, it becomes kind of an interesting question of nature versus nurture, because if you're thinking nature, then it's like this guy was literally created for this purpose, this futuristic entity that, you know, gave him his powers. Like, its purpose is to exterminate mutant kind, and it effectively like tormented him with these horrifying visions that he was ultimately compelled to fulfill. That would be, you know, nature, and perhaps nothing could have prevented that tragedy. But if it's nurture, then it's the question of the whole like idea that like the X-Men, all the reason that they are the heroes that they are is because they found family and community that they are able to, you know, share in and kind of support one another. And Bastion could have been a part of that, and perhaps that would have been enough for him to resist his destiny, as it were. As it stands, he becomes kind of a tragic figure. You know, he does truly monstrous things, not just in trying to exterminate mutant kind, but also basically turning his fellow humans into like technological slaves and weapons.
Well, including his own mother as well.
Yeah, and his mother too. But like, and that's a horrifying thing he does to her. And then you actually get that moment that the show didn't need to put in there if you wanted to make him just a true monster, of the fact that when he does this and then he infects his mother with this virus, and then she becomes one of these entities, but then they shut it down and his mother dies, and he actually goes to the town and you see him holding her body, and he's like devastated. And it's at this stage he's gone far enough down the path that he is just going to double down and recommit and try to commit, you know, continue his war to exterminate mutant kind. But it's a moment where you realize that like that's where I kind of think it's the idea that like perhaps this guy's future could have been different. You know, his destiny wasn't set, but ultimately our choices are what define us, and he chose to become this monster, perhaps because he thought he had to, because he had no choice, but ultimately because this is what he made it his mission to effectively terrorize the world in this way, because he thought it was necessary. He thinks he's the hero of the story, as the best villains often do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and that's really, looking at another character in this story. I mean, that's why Magneto has always been as fascinating as he is, because he too, believes he's the hero. He doesn't see himself as in the wrong, and that's why, like, regardless of the version of that character, I've always found him fascinating, and he's a saint in comparison to well, I say that, but he does, at one point consign all of humanity to dying in the dark. So,
in the original 90s show, the first time we see him, he tries to take over a nuclear base or something, doesn't he, as well? Yeah. He's done some bad things.
Well, that's why I always joke, like, he's an actual proper villain in that first two-parter, and then after that, he's sort of just Xavier's moody bestie. But, well, and as long as we're sort of talking about that, one of the big, like, things about this season, and a big conversation on social media the couple times I did peek at it, is, it's very popular, over the years for people to say Magneto's right, and they made that sort of a focal idea of the season on this show. You know, and we get the character of Cooper, who, you know, duplicitous woman that she turned out to be. You know, her saying kind of, you know, talking about great speeches, you know, in the show, you know, and ending with, you know, I had a thought, the only sane thought you can have when you're, you know, being, you know, chased after by giant robots. Magneto was right. And so, and I know a lot of people will look at that and be like, "Yep, damn straight, Magneto's the right one." Of course, I find it more complicated than that, and I think it's much more nuanced than that. I think what she's talking about in that scene is the fact that, and she may be right about this, that Magneto has perhaps a more realistic view of like an understanding of what humanity is, and it's kind of hard to argue that point of view, whereas Charles takes a more optimistic view and looks at what humanity could be. But a lot of people probably, you know, hear that and they're like, yes, Magneto's the one who's in the right. I'm like, no, he still tries to kill a lot of people. So I don't know what's like. I don't even know what I'm really asking you guys, but like, you know, I know that was kind of a point of discussion for the season.
It was. I think it's interesting because we got into actually criticizing Xavier a little bit in this show, which was cool. He's a more complex character than I think maybe the Fox films have sometimes portrayed him as. I don't know, maybe that's a bit unfair actually, but the Xavier was always beyond reproach, you know, in classic sort of early Claremont / Stan Lee X-Men comics. Xavier was always a paragon. And as the years have gone on, they've introduced more and more controversial storylines with Xavier, where he's done things that have left you a little cold to this character, because he can be duplicitous and manipulative, and he does definitely manipulate students at times. And you know, Magneto says it very early on in the season. I think season episode 2. He says it to Cyclops. You finally realize what I realized long ago, that even Charles Xavier can make a mistake. So I think the Magneto was right thing is kind of, it's a reaction to seeing a different side of that dichotomy of those two characters, where we've always known Magneto is a character who has this tragedy that has formed him into the angsty, angry man that he's became. But there's more to it than that. You know, he really does actually care about mutant kind, and you know, the dream is his dream too. You know, he wants mutants to prosper. He doesn't want to rule necessarily. You could say early Magneto, the first time Magneto was written, he was written as a straight villain back in the 60s. You know, Stan Lee wrote him to be like, I want to rule, and here are my brotherhood of evil mutants. But you know, classically the character has always been that anti-villain. But even, I mean, it's reductionist to say Magneto was right, but it's a shallow understanding of the character of Xavier to say that Xavier was this paragon that he's always presented as, and so it's a fascinating comparison between those two. I wonder what they'll get into with Xavier in the future, because they set up some stuff with him, and I don't know whether they're going to follow through on it. I'll just say the Shi'ar episode, there was some cameos in there that were very interesting in terms of things that they could develop in the future. I don't want to say more than that because people might shout at me for spoiling things.
I will say, like, I'm definitely, and I've used this term a lot in terms of my relationship to the X-Men, but I'm biased in the sense that I grew up with Xavier of the animated series and Patrick Stewart's Xavier, and not any of the comics. So, like, I know you just said it's equally reductive, but I do kind of look at Xavier as a paragon of good. And so, like, even when he does stuff that's a mistake, like, like arguably maybe some of the stuff in this season, I still give him the benefit of the doubt. And I'm like, yeah, but he's trying his best,
He means well. He does mean well.
Yeah.
That is consistent, but he does make mistakes. Xavier, that is. Well, both of them actually.
Yeah, and I think what this show did a really great job at is kind of showing that there's some, like, both of them are stronger together than when they're divided. And so I do like that this season ends in a place where the two of them are reunited, and there seems to be
in
at
ancient
least
Egypt, yeah.
and it does seem like there's some healing that's taking place, but also we haven't really seen them discuss the fallout of everything that happened. So it'll be very interesting to see the two of them interacting next season. I found it so, like, utterly heartbreaking, even though Xavier literally had no other choice, because Magneto was going to let the whole world and die, but I did nonetheless find it very heartbreaking when he takes over his mind, and just the way that Magneto is like, Charles, please, it was just really emotional, especially where they set up earlier in the season that when they were friends, that Charles' mind was always a presence rather than being intrusive. And so the fact that by the end of the season we do see Charles taking control of Eric's mind, and he's been pushed to the point where, like I said, there's really, there's no other choice at that moment, but it is so, like, emotional, and and Magnus, finds it to be a violation. It's like, yeah, but you're doing some pretty heinous stuff. But it's just, I thought that was all just so beautifully done, and again, singing the praises of the music for those scenes, and just the performances, like when Magnus is talking about, when they're in the water and he says it's so cold, it's just so much beautiful stuff in those scenes. And I love the fact that the emotional climax of the season, at least, barring the epilogue stuff, was, yes, Asteroid M is coming down to to Earth, but, like, the key part of the end of the season, it's all about the two of them and their love for one another, and I just love that that's what the climax was rooted in, because so often that can get lost, especially when you're doing, like, big epic stuff in live action, for example. I think there's a tendency to overemphasize the spectacle stuff, and it feels like this was, it had that, but it was predominantly rooted in the emotional character drama.
I agree. Well said.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. And Cassie is making a couple of interesting points in the chat where she brings up that Magneto and Xavier are kind of a brilliant balance, an example of gray areas. So then what does that say about when the driven / evil being the realist and the good being depicted as more gullible / naive? I think that's actually a very incisive, analysis of their dynamic, because the thing about Magneto and Xavier, as you guys have mentioned, is the fact that they do have tremendous affection for each other. One does not want to dominate the world necessarily. They have their perspectives that are opposed at times, but they ultimately have this shared love for each other. But really, it's the fact that their differing visions sometimes lead them into conflict, and their actions are a lot of times what makes them heroic or villainous, or lack of thereof. Because I would say that Magneto does a pretty good job throughout most of the season trying to walk Xavier's path and be more of a heroic character, to show restraint and not use his tremendous power except when he needs to make a point or make an example, but not using it to hurt or kill people. And he does that right up until the moment that Bastion unleashes his techno sentinels all over the world. And then the only way for Magneto to stop him is to basically shut off the Earth's magnetic field and turn all the power off. And you could argue that he had to do that. Otherwise, the sentinels would have overwhelmed the mutant kind. But then he refuses to turn it back on. And basically, because he's basically if I do that, the sentinels come back on and humanity will continue to persecute us. So just let this world die. And that's a villainous perspective. That's an area where you're just that guy's going too far. Now, I think that when a lot of people get into what the whole Magneto is right idea, it's that Magneto is very relatable, not just because of his, because he's a tortured guy. We all have our own internal conflict, hopefully not as deep as Magneto's, but he's a guy who is very much, at war with himself inside, as we see, in the beautiful imagery you alluded to, John, of these raging waters, which when I rewatched Remember It, I actually noted that Rogue talks about the fact the raging waters inside him as the conflict, and then that comes back in the finale.
Yeah, but I noticed that on my rewatch.
Yeah, it's really well done. But the thing about it is that but what I would say is that for Magneto, he is an incredibly tortured guy, and for those of us who have suffered throughout our lives sometimes and have this conflict and are unsure of ourselves, we can sometimes relate more to characters like that than a character like Xavier, who seems like this paragon of virtue, and that's why sometimes people are oh, the good guys are boring, because they're basically they always do the right thing and they never have any moral conflict. They're, so let's either give them moral conflict, or they're just or they're hypocrites. But that's not actually what they are. We see that Xavier is actually a very deeply thoughtful and fascinating character who wields immense power, and the fact that he chooses not to use it except when he absolutely has to is part of what makes him heroic. When he breaks Magneto's mind, that is arguably an evil act. It's an invasive act. He's doing it in that moment because if he doesn't, the world will die. But he doesn't want to do it. He's pleading with Magneto every step of the way, don't make me do this. And if he hadn't done it, arguably the world would have suffered a worse fate. But that's still a cost that Xavier has to bear, and you see that he feels terrible about that choice. But then he tries to make it right. Then he tries to heal Magneto when he very easily could have been this guy just tried to kill the world. He may have been my friend, but now he's lost. Let him go. He doesn't do that. He tries to save them, and he's willing to go down with him if he has to. And I think that is an example of true heroism from Xavier that we see.
Yeah.
It's an ends justify means argument you're making there. Because it is a violation. Magneto's not wrong, but it's. I think I would have done the same thing in Charles's place, but.
Yeah, I mean, I that's one of those things where it's personal violation versus the end of all life on Earth, I'm like,
Yeah.
I get why Charles did it. And,
Charles does
Yeah.
much worse things in the comics. Some of the stuff that he gets up to in the comics is like irredeemable, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, and that kind of stuff that I know that you're alluding to is more of an example of, I think, writers being like, we need to make Charles more of a complicated character. So, and I don't think, and I think I understand that instinct. I tend to think those stories aren't as successful. That the only way to make a heroic character interesting is to give them kind of a villainous edge in that way. But I don't think that's what this show is doing here with Xavier. I think.
No, not here. No.
Yeah. Well, on the subject of what you were mentioning earlier, Jared, about how there's this idea that that morally good characters are quote unquote boring, and it's funny because not to digress into Game of Thrones for a second, but I remember my mom during the first season of Game of Thrones. It was about little over midway through the season, and I said to her, so who's your favorite character on the show? And she's like, I can't really choose. I guess pretty much anybody but Ned. And I'm like, what? I'm like, why? And she's like, he's just kind of boring, isn't he? But then cut to episode 9, and she was in such a state of shock, and she was so angry at me for not telling her that Ned was going to die. And she was like, I'm never watching this show again. So, like, people can say that, but I think at a certain level, like, quote unquote good characters still appeal to to our emotions. We want those paragons of good. They sort of they appeal to us, and they do bring order to the worlds that are depicted, and yeah. So I just always laugh at that, because she may have said one thing, but then her emotions betrayed her.
Yeah, not to psychoanalyze, an audience at large, but I tend to think that when people say good characters are boring, I think what they actually really want is for good characters to be tested and to put their moral values and their powers in conflict with a situation that theoretically could cause them to break their code. This is very much the Batman Joker dynamic, but also like. I feel like you can tell a very interesting story that way, and I think that they do that with Magneto and Xavier in this dynamic. Alert, John! I'm going to praise the MCU. I actually think all the Captain America films do this very well with Steve Rogers and the conflicts that they place him in, forcing him to constantly be tested against his ideals, and then the fact that he holds on to them is what makes him heroic. And I think that sometimes people have struggled to do this with Superman as well. But I think that that's the core of the Superman character. We don't want to we want to see Superman like we know he's, brave and good. We just want to see him come up against something that will actually cause him to, have to question things and break a sweat, as opposed to just, destroy the villains with ease and then go on being, the good boy. So I think that that's a little bit more of the dynamic that's at play. And I think that the Magneto Xavier dynamic is one of the dynamics where, because the two characters themselves are so well balanced, you can kind of play with that a little bit more and let Xavier be this kind of paragon of virtue, but who's not infallible. And Magneto can be more of a villainous character, but he can have, sound logic and be more complicated and do heroic actions. And it's, that makes them both more fascinating to me. All the more so because they have a real affection for one.
Yeah, I think the thing that's always bothered me about the Magneto's right opinion, and not just with this show, but going back years, is the fact that, and I do think that this iteration of Magneto is more of a sort of less outwardly villain, quote unquote villainous. I don't know if you would call that an anti-villain or what, but what I've always rubbed up against with the character in general, not just with the animated series, is that like people think that just because a villain is understandable, that means that they're not a villain. And it's like, no, this is a villain that's three-dimensional, and you're responding to the rich characterization. It doesn't mean that everything they're doing is right. So that's why I kind of always rubbed up against that. But I will say, like, for me, this version of Magneto has always been the most fascinating one, because I think you get to really explore more of the full range of his ideas and his desires for mutant kind, and that it's not always he's not always going to go the villainous route, and yeah, so I've always found that really appealing. And quick sidebar, I will say, to like full admission about, like, you mentioned Captain America in the MCU. Like I probably have been guilty of saying, "Oh, Steve Rogers is boring," because he's just a goody good. But then when I was watching what was the show called, the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And when John Walker came on to the scene carrying the shield and calling himself Captain America, that's when I realized what a great job they did with Chris Evans as as Captain America. Because as soon as John Walker came on the screen, I was like, "Oh, F you." I hated him just because he was, the opposite of everything Steve Rogers represented. So that's a sign that actually I really did respond to Steve Rogers' character.
Sometimes you need to see the photo negative to see what ultimately was there about the original. And I will borrow a line from another beloved animated favorite of ours from the Bad Batch, and quote Tech when he said, "Understanding you does not mean that I agree with you." That is, I think, very much an idea that we can apply to Magneto as well.
Yeah. As we're going to wrap up in a little bit, I just want to run through a couple other things that I wanted to make sure get shout outs. Even though initially I wished we had gotten, and I probably still feel this way, I wish we had gotten more of Madeline once the reveal happened. But then going back, I was like, well, actually, we've gotten a lot with Madeline, because we don't know when the genes are switched. So really, you can look at all of her character development as being, as far back in the original series as you want to take it. And then once I looked at it through that lens, I, on rewatches, I've just found like that the plight of both Madeline and Jean so heartbreaking, and I really love both characters, and the fact that they're characters who have to struggle with that loss of identity, but then ultimately Jean makes peace with that, and she honors Madeline moving forward, and I love the fact that when Sinister is like, "Only I know, where you end and Madeline begins. I can tell you if you ask me nicely." And the fact that she is like, "I don't care, shut up."
As the audience, I was like, I want to know though. Tell us, Sinister.
This was the time when we're like, no, we actually do want the villain to monologue and tell us their entire evil plan.
I actually thought that was a really brave choice, actually, though, to not let us know and just fill that in ourselves. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say it played into the whole idea of Madeline and Jean kind of blending together and the kind of complicated relationship that they now both have with Scott, and with Logan. I love that scene in episode 5 where Logan and Jean have their conversation, and she's talking about what it is to like share these memories, but also in particular with their son Nathan, with Cable, because well, Scott is much more tortured about it. Cable, when he comes back, is basically, he looks at the original Jean Grey and is basically like, you're not my mother. Madeline is my mother, even though they share these experiences. But that becomes one of the truly like gorgeous emotional climaxes in the beginning of the season, which after we lose Madeline in Genosha, like, she's another character who really doesn't, come back after that. Jean is kind of like dealing with that dynamic throughout the entire season, and somehow she manages to kind of get through to Cable and to Scott and to reconcile everything. She has her big Phoenix moment at the end, as she always does, but then they get the incredibly beautiful Grace note where they're talking, they, like, when they've made their sacrifice and they know what they're going to be doing to save the world. The emotion really hinges on the scene where they reach out to Nathan, to this boy who they sent into the future, hoping to have a better life, and that's the moment where we can see that even if Jean didn't actually bear Nathan herself, like, she is his mother in very much the same way, and she loves him as such, and he finally accepts that, and then we get the beautiful moment where Jean allows Scott to like look at his son by holding back his optic blasts, and he said, like, these eyes, like, now they're yours. And I found that like a gorgeous emotional resolution to what could have been a very complicated plot and was at times, but they never lost sight of the emotional core of it, which is the way that these two women are in fact very much one.
The Summers family, the whole Summers family in Marvel Comics is the most convoluted family tree in Marvel Comics. It's crazy.
And we got a further hint of that in the post credits.
Yeah. Well, just before the credits, but yeah. I don't know how much you guys want me to talk about Mother Ascani.
I think that will extend this stream too far, so we'll keep that for maybe a season 2 discussion. Now the Cable thing is funny because even though there are definite like hints towards it in the original series, it is kind of sidestepped, almost entirely. Like, I think there's a part
there's a scene where I think Jean like senses who he is, but it doesn't say it. She never says anything about it, so it's just left hanging.
And then Cable is like, being told by his like computer or whatever about all the X-Men, and he's like, I know all about Scott Summers and Jean Grey, and then that's it. But the Cable thing was always weird in the original series because the first time that we ever see him, there's no hint whatsoever that he's a time traveler. It's just like he's just there in the present, and then somehow in season 2 he's in the future. It's like
I wonder whether that's time travel shenanigans that are just left unexplained. I think maybe he's gone back to try and save Genosha by saving it at the beginning of Genosha.
That's
because he shows up in Genosha the first time we see him in the original show.
That's good. I hadn't even like drawn that connection. That's
because there's kind of a circular time travel thing going on with him in Genosha, but
so but so it was cool to see that they were finally going all in on that in this show. And of course loved the what were you expecting? Black leather.
They had to say it at Wizards.
Yep.
God, yeah, it's stuff like that that really, like, you know, it was really fun to, like, you know, it's that break the fourth wall kind of stuff that's like, you know, it is just a lot of fun. Another moment like that was kind of like, because in the original series there wasn't really ever a specific conflict between Wolverine and Magneto, but I liked the line, you know, after Wolverine stabs Magneto, and does he say something like, "Finally, this what's the word he uses? This conflict, you know, comes to an end." It sort of felt.
I didn't really understand that line. Actually, I was a bit confused by that.
It sort of felt like it was referencing a lot of the film stuff. There's been much more of a Wolverine Magneto kind of rivalry, you know, throughout the live action films. But yeah, if you're looking strictly at the history of like the OG animated series, there's not really a whole lot of context there for that. But,
Wolverine has his villains who are his villains, like Omega Red and Sabretooth and Lady Deathstrike and people like that. But Magneto, not really. But in the films, as you say, yes. But
especially with the line when he says, you know, I've been in a lot of wars, Bub. That felt like a callback to something similar he says in Days of Future Past, the movie.
I think that's also a callback to the first time we meet Magneto in the '90s show, where he says, "What's the next line?"
The brave are always the first to die.
Yeah,
I felt like that was almost an amalgamation of those two things.
Right.
So for better or for worse, I did feel like that bit was referencing the films and their relationship in the films. You know, you can make of that what you will, but like, I don't know. I was fine with it, and because it's, you know, it's sort of a recognition of, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in the X-Men franchise that's happened, you know, since the original series.
And speaking of villainous acts from Magneto, tearing the adamantium off Wolverine's skeleton, not nice.
Like, and that's just a thing, like, even not having read the comics, like, everybody knows about that, you know. Magneto tearing, you know, out Wolverine's adamantium. So to see that, I was like, holy shit! But also, oh my god! So yeah, I hope he survives.
So in the comics, Wolverine, he obviously survives. Of course he does. He always does. In the comics, he like, for a little while he becomes this like savage, like feral Wolverine, and for some reason he's got no nose. Like the way they draw him, they kind of make him look a bit like a Neanderthal. I hope they don't do that, because it was weird. And I don't really like the bone claws that much. So hopefully it will. I
was like,
a bit nod that, but hopefully they don't keep him like that for too long.
I was like, did all of the adamantium come out, or
I think so.
Okay, well, hopefully that heals too, because I'm with you. I'm like, I'm not a fan of the bone claws. I never really have them.
Yeah, I think it won't take long before we get the adamantium back. I think it's not far into season 2. We'll get a similar storyline with him as we did with Storm in season 1 a little bit, actually, maybe. We actually didn't get that much of Wolverine until the final episode. He was uncharacteristically not really central to the story. We've gotten so much of Wolverine over the years that it was almost refreshing to actually have an X-Men story where he wasn't the main, you know, game in town.
Well, and a really engaging X-Men story where he wasn't the central focus, because actually they've made attempts at it. I think probably the most successful X-Men film without Wolverine being central to it was probably X-Men First Class.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, but for the most part, when they didn't have Wolverine, the films kind of floundered a bit. So it was actually really great to see that he was still there and still being his Wolverine self, and and that was a lot of fun. But he wasn't the central focal point of the season, which is great because he wasn't really that in the original series either. He certainly had episodes where he was the focal point.
He had a lot of solo episodes,
yeah. But it does feel like they kind of have to right the ship a bit and like get people back into a frame of mind of this is the X-Men. It's not Wolverine. And I thought they did a great job of that. And by the way, I will just say, like, they just did such a phenomenal job with Cyclops this season. That's the Cyclops I know and love. Poor guy has had a rough go of it ever since the original series went off the air. So I was very happy to see them do him right. I don't know. Anything else that you guys wanted to cover before we wrap things up?
I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think is coming up for season 2? What are you expecting?
I'll let you go first, Jared.
Yeah.
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, so obviously the big tease at the end was Apocalypse, and also time travel again. Because it is noticeable that we now have groups of characters, and it looks like 3 different timelines. There is there are the characters who got left behind in the present day, like Wolverine and Morph and Jubilee and Sunspot. And then there's the characters who are in the distant future, which is Cyclops and Jean, and it looks like they're with a younger version of their son, and Mother Ascani, as mentioned, who also has ties to them. And then the rest of the characters are in the past with it looks like the young version of Apocalypse. And then, of course, we see at the very tease at the end, we see Apocalypse, fully formed Apocalypse in the present day, and that's when he picks up the Gambit card. And that's when I was like, they had me believing so much that they had actually stuck to it, and I think they did a brilliant job with that. But now Gambit's coming back because of that one shot right there. But I would say that I think that what they're probably going to do, because we get that little idea that it looks like Forge and Bishop are kind of going to be like the point men for like looking for the X-Men and trying to bring them all home. But I have a feeling that it's going to be one of those time situations where it's like the events of the past are influencing the events of the present with what's going on with Apocalypse, and then somehow the future is going to tie into that as well. And so basically, to quote Doctor Who, we're going to get a bunch of timey-wimey shenanigans, and I think it'll be really fun. But also, I think Apocalypse and his horsemen, one of which may look familiar.
One thing I do want to say, you mentioned Wolverine, Morph, and also I don't know if you mentioned Storm, but they're actually not in the present. They're unaccounted for.
Oh, that's true. Because they were on Forge's board as like missing in action, and obviously Forge was like where it was,
because they were on the what's it called, the Blackbird, or the
the Blackbird-esque Blackbird that goes to space, apparently.
So we haven't seen where they've landed yet. So that'll be interesting to find out.
I think Bo DeMeo has hinted that they may also be in the future, but he hasn't said too much more on that. So
that might make sense, because otherwise it's just Jean and Scott there with the new characters. So So maybe, but you're right. I had forgotten that. I had just kind of mentally checked them down as being in the present, but in fact, the only characters we see in the present are Jubilee and Sunspot and Forge and Bishop and
there are other X-Men characters that are still around that they could maybe get. We could see them in the present as well. I mean, I keep saying it. Forge has this like storyboard of like where are all the mutants?
The one that was really the one that was really interesting for me because he was actually, unless I'm mistaken, he was in Genosha, and that's Archangel. But
did we see him there?
Yeah.
There's so many cameos in the Genosha.
He's at the party. But on the board it says that he's missing. You know, so he's
obviously he has a big history with Apocalypse in the show and in the comics. So if we're doing Apocalypse next season, we may well see him.
Yeah. So I'm really hoping, and I'm like, if it's Apocalypse, like you said, the Archangel will be a part of that story. You know, as you mentioned before, Shadowcat is on that board. So it would really be great to see them finally bring Kitty Pryde. You know,
Colossus as well. Like we were missing Colossus this season. He was in the original show at times. He wasn't one of the main roster, but we saw him a couple of times, I think. And his little sister, who's a really cool character, actually, Ileana, her name is, but her code name is Magic with a K. Morph turned into her at one point.
I know.
Which, by the way, AR and I, if I drank, it would have been a drinking game. When we were doing a watch party of the first 2 seasons of this show, we never got past that. And this was a couple of years ago. So I was wrong. I actually have watched some of the series, you know, in the past couple of years. But that was it. It was the episode where Colossus, I think, when he goes back to Russia or something, looking for his sister, and every time he went, Ileana, it was like drinking. So yeah. No, it would be good to see both of them back and in a different capacity to what they were used in the original series. So
because we only saw her as a kid, I think, in a brief cameo in the original series, but we've seen her as a grown-up. Morph turned into her, which implies that she has become the character that she becomes in the comics already in this continuity. So I wonder if she has appeared at some point in the year between the end of the 90s show and this show, the start of this show, if they had some kind of adventure that we didn't get to see with Magic. She's a cool character. She's I had a conversation with William once, and that's his favorite X-Man, which is cool. So I'm hoping for his sake that we get to see that next season.
And I would kind of like to. I'd like to see Psylocke in here because we actually did get her in the 4-part Beyond Good and Evil storyline in the original series. But
we briefly see her in this as well in the montage where we see like Daredevil and all those characters in the finale. Okay. I think we see Psylocke at one point. So she's still around.
Yeah, and I'll just say I want to like see a little bit more of Spider-Man.
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, that's a whole other matter. Is the animated Spider-Man show coming back? This has been universally praised, I think, more or less, apart from certain bad actors on the internet. But I do think there might be some pressure to get the Spider-Man animated show back again. Although I think they're already doing a Spider-Man animated show, a different one.
Yeah, I was like, that's really bad timing. They should have. But so I don't know. Maybe that one won't do so well. But it's Spider-Man. Spider-Man always does well.
I don't know if there are issues with like Sony and licensing as well. Whether they'd be able to do it. Probably they would, but I don't know.
but that's the thing. Like, if they decide not to move forward with that, then I'd like to, give us like, one or two episodes where like, where Spider-Man, comes in and plays a role. Like they did it the other way on the original Spider-Man show, where they had that 2-part crossover. So I say, yeah, well, go ahead and, do it. It doesn't have to be, anything major, but just,
Yeah,
oh,
I
yeah,
mean, we
that
got
would
to
be
spend
fun.
some time with Captain America, so why not Spider-Man or a bunch of other characters for that matter?
I'm still fantasizing about the idea that that version of Spider-Man is going to show up in Beyond the Spider-Verse. But we shall see. Aside from like characters wanting to show up, I mean, it's the same thing as Jared. Obviously, Apocalypse is going to play a big part. If I hadn't heard what you said, if Bo DeMeo said that Wolverine, Morph, and Storm are also in the future, that would make sense, because also that would give them more opportunities to play up whatever's going on between Jean and Wolverine.
Yeah, well, that'd be interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I'm just really excited, but also it seems like it might be a little bit of a wait for season 2 based on what I've been reading. But in the meantime, I'm just gonna enjoy what we got here. I'm just so pleased with what we got. It's like, minor nitpicks aside, like this season was a dream come true, something that I never in a million years thought we'd get. And so I'm just over the moon. And even though I know it'll be a way off because the series just dropped, I'm going to go ahead and start bugging, Marvel and Disney for that 4K Blu-ray.
Tell them to get on the Bad Batch too while they're at it. But yeah, I'm very keen to see what season 2 will hold, and when we obviously Marvel is now ramping up with the X-Men, given the fact that they now have the rights to the characters. They just announced the writer for the live action movie they'll eventually be doing. They've got Deadpool and Wolverine as well. But it is nice to know that they have this, kind of in their back pocket. Another thing, this is less fun, but I will, acknowledge the fact that also the series, even though he finished writing the second season before he was terminated, let go, parted ways, the series will now be moving forward without Bo DeMeo, who was the major creative voice and showrunner on the first season. We haven't gotten any explanation as to why that is. I don't really care to speculate. I've heard rumors. I don't really want to substantiate them without having anything to back him up. What he did on this first season was extraordinary. And I do think that his vision for season 2 is going to continue, but it may be a slightly different show because there will be a slightly different, creative voice taking the reins, even based on the writing of those things. So it's just something to bear in mind. These kind of creative shakeups happen, but in this case, the guy wrote pretty much every episode of the first season. This was clearly his baby. So you might notice something, we might not. It's just something to bear.
Yeah,
I don't think it has to suffer necessarily for it, but yeah, it is unfortunate. But we'll see.
They just need to they do need to make sure they get someone good to follow them up. And we could give in to fears about it not being as good, but also there's other instances of somebody else coming in after an initial season of the show and doing a great job with it. So I don't know. I'm just like, I think next season, I think it'll work well as a transition where they'll still have the strips by him, but it'll be somebody else kind of leading the charge. So yeah, I'd fingers crossed they find the right person to continue on. No reason to worry about it yet. We're just coming off season 1.
Yeah, and Marvel, if you do want somebody new, I'm available. I would very much like that job. So give me a call. No.
I will just say before we close out, just in reference to what you were saying, Jared, about how they've hired somebody for the live action X-Men film. It's still very early days. My theory on that is actually that it may still take a few years for that film to come to fruition. And I think what we may see is that this show will sort of be their X-Men vehicle for the next number of years. I think what they're in the midst of right now with like the current phases, I think they're going to be utilizing a lot of the Fox X-Men, stuff to sort of give audiences, the X-Men and to maybe give a nice swan song also to that era of the X-Men, and all the while also having this show on Disney Plus. And then I think that sort of once both of those things have run their course, I think it'll coincide with their new live action version of the X-Men coming out in cinema. So I'm actually just going to really enjoy this sort of era of the X-Men because it's really given me everything I want. I cannot wait for Deadpool and Wolverine in July. I'm just going to have so much fun with that. I think, as X-Men fans, we're really winning this year because the X-Men is leading the charge. I think the only thing not X-Men coming from Marvel this year is later in the year. The Agatha show is coming out, but aside from that, it's it's all X-Men all the time. So
and we did get Echo earlier this year, but that
that's
that
right.
also was drawing on like properties that used to belong to Fox with the Daredevil mythology. So.
Oh, which, by the way, of course, even though they won't confirm it, but it's pretty well established and well known that that Jennifer Gardner's Elektra will be in Deadpool and Wolverine, and that just cracked me up. Just such an obscure thing to pull from, but I love it. But yeah, no. So I love this season. Love getting to talk about it with you guys. And thank you so much, Dan, for coming on. We did go a little bit longer than planned. Hopefully, not too late for you.
No, not too bad. I'm used to it. As I said to you before we got on there, I have a girlfriend in Canada, so quite used to being up late.
Yeah, and I will say the past couple of days I've been devoid of sleep, so I will say that I think I'm going to crash tonight and finally catch up on some Z's. So looking forward to that. But yeah, just any final comments on anything before we sign off?
There was one thing I wanted to cover that I didn't get the chance to say, which was just a quick point really, but shout out to, I think it was Ron Wasserman, who was the composer of the theme tune to the original cartoon, which is just one of the best TV theme tunes of all time. There's no debate needed. It's just as soon as it comes in, I think every X-Men fan starts going like everyone does that when it makes that noise. It's just
and it's so funny because
I wanted to give this shout out because they didn't credit him on this. They credited the theme tunes to Saban, I think, for legal reasons. So yeah, just for that fact alone, I think the original composer of that theme tune needs some props, and needs his name to be.
Which I will say, if you've read the book by the showrunner of the OG show that I mentioned earlier in the stream, and you read his accounts of dealing with Saban, like, nothing about the fact that Saban is credited for the music for legal reasons will surprise you.
Okay.
That is like just because I think they said something about the fact that, after they had an enormously successful first season of the OG show, Saban actually cut everybody's budget for the second season. so yeah, it's the fact that poor Ron Wasserman is goes uncredited for that music is just terribly sad, but also kind of predictable. Yeah,
So,
just absolutely amazing.
Any chance you get, if you're a fan of this show, of this franchise, let people know that Ron Wasserman was the composer, not Saban, because that's just corporate BS to me, and it makes me uncomfortable to see that. But yeah.
Yeah, I think pretty much any theme song of that era that you loved for TV shows, with the exception of obviously Danny Elfman doing the Batman main theme, but this Power Rangers was done by Ron Wasserman. Like, the man was just a genius. He was great. So yeah, I all props to him, and I'm so happy, even though it's not the exact version from the original series. It's close enough. I'm very happy to finally have a soundtrack with the main theme on that I can play over and over and over. So yeah, just great. I'm trying to think if there was something else I was gonna say. If there was, I've forgotten it. But thank you, guys. Again, thank you everybody who tuned in tonight. So great to see you all here, and thank you for chatting along with us. And yeah, just a reminder that next week, Jared and I will be talking about Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. The week after that, we'll be talking about the 2020 version of Emma, starring Anya Taylor-Joy, and we'll follow that up with our Revenge of the Sith discussion. So I hope you guys all tune in for that. Anything you want to say, Jared, before we close off?
No, just this was a great discussion. I'm happy that I caught up with the show, even if I abandoned my project to rewatch the original animated show. I still think this show on its own stands beautifully. And I guess in the spirit of wrapping things up and encouraging everyone to because this show deals with some heavy themes, so I would just leave it on a lighter note, which is the one where Charles Xavier takes the Empress of the Shi'ar Empire and her murderous sister and sits them all down in a classroom and makes them and makes them, and it's like, now I'm going to teach you with a blackboard and all about the virtues of coexistence. And he says, coexistence is messy, the universe very old, and all of us very young, born of ancient stardust, and all children of the atom, which I think is a beautiful note to for him to try to bring everyone together before his mind is consumed with the visions of horror that await in the future and future seasons of the show. So, but try to live up to those words.
And also demerits.
The Children of Stardust, I think, is what he says, isn't it? Which is very Carl Sagan, actually, which I love. Yeah. I think that I feel like that was a deliberate sort of reference there, but
I think my favorite part about that is like just when he just starts off by saying coexistence is messy. It's just an acknowledgement on his part that he knows how difficult it is. Like, he's not under any illusions that it's an easy thing. But okay, before we get drawn back into conversation about the show, thank you again, all, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, Jared, as always, and thank you, Dan, for joining us. It was so great to have you on. And,
My pleasure.
I hope you all have an absolutely wonderful night. Bye.
You too.